Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hi, it's so nice to see you, Taína. I'm wonderful. And you?
I'm doing okay. So I think what's really interesting about this is that we recorded like maybe like 6 months ago. I forget the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And so much has happened since then. So can you kind of give us some updates because some really important stuff has happened.
Yeah, just like my ethics of clinical documentation and perinatal therapy course, the socio-political climate constantly changing is consistently shifting how reproductive mental health therapists are practicing and documenting and things we need to be aware of. And I can't remember a time as a professional counselor in which the climate and the what's going on around us have so deeply affected how flexible and on top of all sorts of socio-political evolutions I've had to be. I can recommend to clients that they take a step back from politics, but it feels really important to stay engaged in that myself right now because it's influencing how thoughtful I am about what content I'm putting in documentation. It is influencing how I'm checking in with clients and what I want to make sure they feel supported about. And there are so many different moving parts that I touch on in the ethics of clinical documentation course um, that are also progressing, like health information exchanges, legislation around interstate telehealth, access to telehealth, and also reproductive freedom defense acts is a phrase a lot of governors have been using in legislation they've been crafting around protections for mental health professionals. Um, and then, as if that wasn't enough, insurance is also changing. Insurances are rapidly evolving and growing and thinking about how they can keep as much of their money as possible. And so, as a therapist who takes commercial and public insurances, I'm also constantly thinking about how do I make sure that I'm setting myself and my clients up to protect our work and protect their information and protect my livelihood as a therapist owning my business.
So I think that something that I'll say, and I am biased,
Yeah.
is that I've taken every course that you've given. Um, Back in the days when we used to do that in person.
It's been a little
Uh,
while.
right. Um, so I so I think that there is this value, and what I'll say is that I'm licensed in Connecticut, Texas, and Florida. And so those other two states have some different implications for what can happen to me if I cross state lines. I'm wondering if you might have just kind of some tips and tricks for that, like the preview.
Yeah. While there isn't division necessarily between reproductive mental health therapists, I think until we were living in a post Dobbs and then subsequent legislation world, I don't think how we practiced and documented had to be so distinct. There are certain states where you need to be more vigilant about everything down to what you say in a session. If in theory you're following the rules, which I always recommend following your rules of your state and governing body and your professional organization, but you have to be cautious in a really different way. And the stakes are higher in some states than others. And I think that's relevant not just because of the SIPACT, the Counselor Compact, and the upcoming social work and MFT interstate practice compacts that I hope will be activated sooner rather than later, but also because of health information exchanges. You can go anywhere in the country right now and just about every major health system is probably using the same hospital-based electronic health record. And the same electronic health record has a contract with national organizations. Think about the VA or any large government entities, federally funded places, and all that information is being shared. So while there's in theory confidence in the therapy room or the therapy space, it's what's documented is not nearly as private as it used to be. When I was in grad school, we talked about having two forms of security, like locking a cabinet in a locked room. And it doesn't really matter how many locks are on the cabinet if everyone who has a large nationally known EHR that shall remain nameless access to that file. And there are certain safeguards in place, like tracking of account activity, but the harm can already be done at that point. So being thoughtful about finding that magical balance, which is, as so much in counseling, an art form, not a science, of how much information to include, and not so that you don't get an insurance clawback, but not enough to incriminate healthcare provider, whether it's yourself or another healthcare provider on the treatment team or the client. And the last thing anyone wants to do when taking a healthcare provider oath is we want to do no harm. So how do we practice and create a good case to, if we're audited or when we're audited, really, a chart review comes up, we can make our case that the claim should have been paid, that the date of service was medically necessary. We can prove that confidently. And if the socio-political climate evolves in one certain direction, that we're not incriminating provider, client, and other healthcare providers.
One of the things that I really felt confident with leaving the last training that you gave was what to include in session notes. I'm wondering if, as we're thinking about that transition from when we did not have to be worried about these outside entities, and now we perhaps, depending on where we practice, do, or if our client lives in our state and moves to a state where we do have to worry about that, maybe one or two things that we should be really mindful of.
That's a great question, Taína. And I would go a step further and not just think about moving, but visiting, traveling for work, to visit family. A lot of people have grandparents who live out of state. Just being located in a state where somebody may not have access to reproductive standard of care, they might be visiting a forced birth state for work, that could present an unexpected crisis of ethics and safety. Somebody might not risk being arrested in the moment, but they might risk getting mistreatment by somebody who accesses records you didn't know they were going to be able to see. And then what you've documented 5, 6, 7 months ago, depending on how far they go back, could impact the care that the quality of care someone is receiving, how they're treated, or in the worst case scenario, they're criminalized and reported. And there have been instances in which people have reproductive medical emergencies while traveling for work or family, and they don't have access to the care they need. And also that there are instances in which people's records from home have been accessed when they are away. So being vague and thoughtfully vague, it's quite a strategy, and I think it's a muscle to be flexed and practiced again and again, is really important. So I've been doing a lot of documenting the past couple of years about healthcare updates, healthcare news. The client has news about their health, and you can let your imagination run wild with what that might mean. Or progress toward healthcare goals is a really crafty way of talking about a positive pregnancy test, for example. The course has a lot of different examples, and I have a handout of how to document creatively and different phrases and ideas to use. And there are also tools that we're going to talk about how to further expand that language so that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting in terms of trying to make sure that you're not incriminating anyone by accident or putting anyone in a vulnerable spot unintentionally.
And can you tell us about who is the ideal candidate to take this course? So some trainers say when you're early on in your career or when you're later on in your career, but just tell us what that might look like for your course.
Yeah. I am very transparent that this course is adamantly pro-reproductive rights. So if that's not a value you share, you might not enjoy my class as much as somebody else. This course is directed at the Touchstone offering is directed at reproductive mental health. So that's family planning, infertility, pregnancy loss, prenatal and postpartum mental health, all those things under that reproductive umbrella. I do touch on interstate legislation. I touch on and the case examples around diagnosis. I think we could all use support around furthering our differential diagnoses, and then how to be thoughtful about insurance industry. I have worked in the insurance industry in the past, longer than I wish, and I have that experience. So I look at how outside entities are looking at this as a practice that has long taken public health insurance as well as commercial. I try to think about the different strategies and what everyone is looking for, and I've attempted to compile from many big entities what's everyone looking for. What are the common threads between these different entities that may request your records? What's the legislation saying? What do our codes of ethics say? And what are the best practices, as well as thinking about recent lawsuits, liability, and how to protect folks from as much liability as possible. There have been some legal consults engaged in this, the content creation here, trying to make sure that we're thinking about all the different ethical components that go into practicing, following best practices or practicing to the best of your ability, given the socio-political climate and the rapidly evolving technology impact, the technology landscape as it impacts mental health care.
So, Catherine, there have been some pretty significant political situations that have influenced what's going on with the health of birthing people. Can you tell us a little bit about how this is affecting people who are seeking out your services, and also for the therapists, because I know that you consult and supervise for the therapists who are dealing with this?
I think there has been a lot more need for consultation. I've talked to a lot of folks across the country since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then subsequent legislation. There are 3 kinds of legislation that are impacting reproductive access. There are zombie laws, which are laws that existed prior to Roe that got resurrected. And now that Roe v. Wade decision has been overturned by the Dobbs decision, the Roe v. Wade lawsuit was overturned by the Dobbs decision. There are zombie laws that have been in effect. I'm talking Civil War times, dating back to the Civil War era of this country, that are now applying to modern day society, hundreds of years before IVF and fertility treatments of any sort were available. And then there are trigger laws. I don't like that violent language, but laws that were set to go into effect when and if Roe was overturned. And then there are yet more states who are promising new legislation and evolving legislation, trying to pass new legislation. And some of it's also been a campaign strategy going into an election year, rushes and attempts to promise or enact legislation to sway elections. And I think we saw that in Alabama, where there was a halt on IVF at the beginning of this year or late February. And that case is still going on. My understanding is that some IVF treatments have resumed, but they all came to a screeching halt when people sued and were arguing over whether an embryo was considered a person or had a right to personhood, is the legal language that's being used. Alabama IVF clinics have gone all the way up to the Supreme Court and are asking for them to appeal the state rulings. I don't want to get too far into it, but it is still very much going on. That there are problems where wrongful death legislation is being applied to little balls of cells that can't grow and become a human without a human who's already existing, has a uterus, wants to gestate. And then there's the question of who has more right to decision making, cells that can't grow extrauterine, or the person whose uterus is at the center of the argument. So things are quite volatile. Perhaps, I don't want to say most, I don't want to rank the worst of the worst. There's a lot of rough stuff going on in the world. And then additionally, there's been understandable buzz about Project 2025 and the suggested agenda around Project 2025, what that entails if the Trump-Vance ticket is elected. There are multiple facets, if Project 2025 were enacted, that would just further obliterate reproductive rights of anyone who has capacity to become pregnant or give birth. There are talks of repealing FDA approval for abortion medication and going back to the Comstock Act. making it illegal to ship abortion pills and supplies. And the vast majority of abortions in this country currently are medication pill abortions as opposed to a surgical procedure. So restricting access when we have online telehealth and interstate telehealth that are keeping some access in those forced birth states are at risk. They want to redefine emergency contraception or Plan B as an abortifacient. And that poses a great risk to anyone who has unexpected pregnancy risk. And then there are further consequences and risks to abortion access in blue or standard of care states. There's a lot that's endangering reproductive health care, and not just pregnancy versus abortion related care, but medical emergencies, life-threatening emergencies, and access to medications that could be used in and are being mislabeled by extreme political extremists as related to abortion that actually treat many other conditions. I do talk in my training a little bit about methotrexate, which can be a life-saving medication in an ectopic pregnancy, and it can also treat lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and a whole host of other inflammatory conditions. So we are not just talking about reproduction, but really obliterating the standard of care for many health conditions that impact so many people. And then conversely, the election is getting real exciting, and I'm curious to see what the newest will be when the training is offered live at the end of September, because up until those days before, we're going to be talking about what the politicians are promising, offering, or threatening, it feels like, for some of these policies. But as a reproductive therapist and somebody who cares very much about access to healthcare, it's been really hope instilling and promising to hear Tim Walz talking in such passionate favor of protecting reproductive rights and about the importance of his own personal impact on his family's fertility journey in just helping him truly understand what that experience is like for, as you and I know, 1 in 4 families who experience fertility challenges. So he's really resonating with a lot of people, I think, and hope that will be motivating and inspiring, talking openly about his own family's IVF journey and how critical it is that as many people as possible have access to that healthcare. And in turn, we need to be able to safely support clients through that without fear of litigation or criminal consequences.
So I'm going to ask you a clarifying question because, I just got back to the States after a month away from the news cycle here. And so Tim Walz?
Yeah. Tim Walz.
I tend to have this bias that if people know about what this journey is like, they might have more compassion and understanding for people who are going through this.
Mm-hmm.
But he said something that was more just kind of aware of the situation. So I was hoping that you might be able to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was really touched to see an interview recently. I've seen him tell a story more than once in the past week about his own family's journey. I believe he and his wife worked for 7 years to grow their family. And he shares very emotionally and openly about the grief that they experienced when reproductive treatments didn't work and how hard that journey was as a non-birthing partner, and how helpless he felt and how much he doesn't want Americans to feel that and go through that, and how important access to reproductive health care was for his family, because it is under the umbrella of healthcare. I think everyone has a right to fertility treatment, and it is very clear that Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor running for Democratic vice president, agrees with that. I feel very hopeful about what that election could do for our profession, our discipline within the profession of mental health, and just taking that seriously and having a personal stake in reproductive health care. I've also seen interviews where he's been very passionate about women's reproductive access in general. And he's got some slogan, I don't have a direct quote, but something to the effect of mind your own business. And just very much stressing that it's your choice what you do and it's not really my business. And I think that's what a lot of people with uteruses and reproductive capacity need, is they need politicians and insurance companies as much as possible to stay out of their reproductive decisions. And I think that we can empower clients by helping facilitate them getting really great mental health care and having insurance pay for that when appropriate, and not putting them at risk of liability.
Yeah, I think that one of the most interesting memes that I have seen recently was if a woman does not have children,
Mm-hmm.
they either don't want to or can't, and that's none of your business. And I just censored that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in that political climate. So I'm wondering what might be the best tips or tricks that you might give to people who are starting up in this, because I see a lot of posts that are like, what training should I take? How do I best prepare? And I think that I I will only speak for myself, but they didn't teach any of this in my grad school. They didn't talk about women at all or their reproductive organs or what happens with fertility. So there are so many people who want to be in this situation where they're appropriately treating clients. How would you recommend that they like get themselves appropriately trained?
I would recommend they join us at Touchstone Institute for Ethics of Clinical Documentation and Perinatal Therapy, because my goal is to cover what your grad school didn't teach you. And grad school isn't, and that's no disregard to them. I'm really proud of my alma mater, but their job was to give me the starting foundation. And they can't possibly cover all the different requirements that Optum or Aetna or Anthem might require of you, or what your individual state where you might land and practice Medicaid might require of you, or what J.D. Vance's opinion, or the I'm blanking on his name right now, the Oklahoma Attorney General I'm blanking on his name. The Oklahoma Attorney General has been really passionately adamant, outwardly vocal about the fact that he's eager and ready to prosecute anyone who helps, aids, abets, or facilitates someone getting an abortion. He's on a witch hunt. And I think there's a lot of misogyny that remains in our country that's been emboldened by certain politicians, and political agendas are now facilitating that risk being increased to those who identify as female, assigned female at birth. LGBTQIA families are at tremendous risk with both reproductive restriction and anti-trans and anti-queer legislation. And so we're going to touch on all of those and just how to be aware, mindful of vulnerable clients and the hostile political environments that we might be working in, thinking about the different layers of system, the Bronfenbenner's chrono system, like the different layers going outward of influence and resources and access. And I come from, and I'm grateful to be located in a standard of care state right now, but I'm also trying to be thoughtful and not sit in a place of privilege in this training about the fact that it might not be as safe for certain attendees to be as outspoken as I feel safe being in Connecticut. And how do you craft a safe space for clients to know that you're a safe space to go to, and build those bridges to clinicians that are in safe harbor or protected states, so that you can make sure clients in need get the care that they need, whether it's not safe to be vocal or it's not safe to practice maybe the way you used to practice, or you're trying to adapt how you practice to stay safe in a more hostile state.
Yeah, that definitely strikes me as true, especially when I even think about when I ask or when I offer for people to put their pronouns up. That's not necessarily because we're practicing across states, but also across countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an invitation. I wonder, and I'm really excited that you're doing this training. I'm actually registering for the training because
I'd
you rock.
love to have you there.
But it's really because it just continues to change.
Mm-hmm.
Everything continues to change, and there's not like this fountain of, there's not this really specific place where it says, hey, here's what's changed, here is what you should consider. And that's kind of what I experience your courses as.
I've been training for a while, and I've been teaching continuing ed in reproductive mental health since smaller presentations in 2015 and on a bigger scale since 2017. And no training that I've ever done has been done once and then never updated. But this training is unlike any other, where the pace at which it needs to be updated to be current with legislation, risks, things to be aware of, entities to be on the lookout for, it feels like it changes by the day. And I've never had a training where the content changes wildly in a matter of weeks before this. And I don't think this training will ever be truly done. There have been instances in which I've sent out a bigger update to folks who've attended this or something similar to say, hey, these are what's changed since we last connected. And that's something I'm eager to do for attendees, probably in November. And I hope, in January and the months in early 2025, I feel really hopeful that we'll have some exciting changes to make. And if we offer this course at Touchstone again in, 6 months later, it could be a very different course yet again. And I live in hope, we could be talking about restoration of reproductive rights and protections for healthcare privacy. That would be a much more exciting course to teach. This one's a little heavy. I try to give breaks, and we've broken the course up between 2 days because it is a lot of content and a lot of emotional output to put into one day, but really critical information to have. And the feedback that I've had historically from attendees is, wow, that was a lot, and I've learned so much. That's a lot to implement, and I'm still kind of digesting it. And so I want to make sure we're going at a pace that people feel they can digest it and have time to ask follow-up questions and also take care of themselves emotionally, because many people are drawn to reproductive mental health from their own lived experiences. We have a personal investment in this. We care about our clients. We care about the issues at hand that intersect and relate to this topic. And this is our livelihood. And you deserve to be able to provide really great therapy to your clients, to document what you need to keep the money paid to you for it, and to not worry about some gung-ho radical attorney general coming after you with a civil or criminal lawsuit.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that you're going to be teaching this course. I think that it is very necessary. I recommend it whenever I see people in our clinician Facebook groups who are saying, hey, I'm concerned about this, I'm concerned about that. And I'm just like, so I'm really thankful that you're doing this. I think that the last question that I usually ask is, what are you reading right now?
Oh, what am I not reading? I'm reading a lot of news, and I'm following a couple of researchers, trying to keep up on the latest constantly. Emily Oster has done some political stuff, but not as much. Jessica Valenti has a Substack, Abortion Every Day, which has helped me keep up on some of that. I'm following the Center for Reproductive Rights. Human Rights Campaign has had some stuff. The Guttmacher Institute. I'm trying to keep track of them. I'm trying locally to follow health information exchange developments and also find a balance of staying on top of the election without feeling too much emotional fatigue around that and stay in a good place. And this course was also created with a ton of book references that I'll provide in the course. I have another shelf similar to this one further off screen, and that's where my abortion, healthcare rights, and healthcare law books are shelved at the moment. So I'm happy to share book recommendations in the course, references and resources. And I highly recommend following Center for Reproductive Rights. There are a number of resources that are client-facing in the training as well for attendees to take back to practice right away and share with clients who might need them.
I love that so much, and I'm so looking forward to your course.
Thank you. I can't wait to spend a couple of days with you. I'm so glad you'll be there too.
Yeah, I'm so grateful, and thank you so much for taking this time to have some Tuesday tea with me. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to see everybody at Ethics of Clinical Documentation and Perinatal Therapy at the end of September.